Testing 1, 2, 3.
Where am I supposed to be looking, by the way?
Oh, that's your camera.
Yeah.
That's just an additional, and that's mine. But look at me.
No, I don't look at you.
Nobody wants to look at me, Ant, but you
No,
have
that's
to
right.
do it.
I've got bad depth perception, so if I look straight at it and I don't see you, it's quite awesome.
You shouldn't be talking to the camera. It's too much. Unless it's like there's a message.
Maybe for you it's too much, but for me the camera loves me.
The camera loves you.
Yeah.
Everybody loves you. It's just because I don't know you. Right,
No,
can
everybody
we do
loves
this?
Raymond, you know?
Oh, you know what? We're doing one episode. How do we have bloopers in one episode? It's just too much.
Are you recording it, Morgan?
Too much. Of course he's recording it. He knows better. You see, and now that it's not on Zoom, it doesn't have your session is being recorded. All right, here we go. Are we ready?
Just say I was bullied into this.
1, 2, 3.
This is Synthesis TV, keeping you on the edge of technology and business.
A very good morning to you. We're back. I'm Howard Feldman, and this is the Sunday Synthesis Podcast with me, Howard Feldman, and of course, Dr. Anton Meyberg. We're not exactly Simon and Garfunkel, right? So it isn't one of those reunions, but it is good to be back. How are you? How have you been?
I'm a bit nervous.
Rubbish.
No, I'll tell you why.
Why?
Normally I've got doom and gloom and I've got bad things to say and I've got all these facts and all these things. And there's actually good news from the beginning. So it's kind of a change in the whole sort of diatribe there. So maybe we should start at the end and do it for 1 minute. So is there good news at the end and that's it?
All right. So let's go right back. Let's start this right at the beginning. COVID-19. How does it look in the world today on November the 20th, 2022?
So I think what we're looking at the moment is an infectious disease that's very different to what we were seeing 2.5 years ago.
Okay.
I mean, if we look at January 2020 and compare it to where we're at now, it's just a virus. But is it just a virus? And that's what we've got to try and work out and try and understand from it. In other words, do we take it seriously or do we ignore it or do we still have to put measures in place? And I think what we've got to understand is the most prevalent subvariant at the moment in the world is the BA5, which is a subvariant of the Omicron, which was the BA1, which we know that was the bad
that was
virus.
the one that we all had, right?
Well, not all of us.
Okay, well, some of us.
Some people, you know. But that was the one that people got when they were already vaccinated. And that's why the disease intensity wasn't so bad and the severity wasn't so bad. But that's what's essentially the major variant going around in the world at the moment. There are other subvariants. There's a BQ1 and a BQ1.1, which are appearing most adept at sort of invading the vaccine neutrality.
Right.
And there's a few other variants of concern or variants of interest. The B1617.2 is a variant in India.
I'm not writing any of these down. Do I need to?
Don't write them down.
Okay. Fine.
So if we look in the northern hemisphere, going into winter, COVID's a big problem because there's going to be a surge in COVID infections. But that being said, is it a big problem? And the answer is no, because of vaccination. Because people have been vaccinated, same way as with influenza. Yes, people will get sick, and the majority of people will not land up in hospital. So therefore, we've got to treat it as a pure respiratory infection.
Right.
And when you get sick, there's certain measures to follow and certain things to do.
So I just want to stop you there. Is it less dangerous because in the life cycle of a pandemic and a virus, it weakens through the process? Or is it because so many of us are vaccinated and therefore have a certain amount of protection to it?
So I think the latter is more obvious for us because of the fact that we're vaccinated and there's herd immunity. The virus is there. You know, if we weren't vaccinated, we'd be in the throes of a Delta type outbreak with people dying everywhere. Okay. But it's very similar in essence to respiratory viruses like influenza, which we're going to bring up a few times. You can still be vaccinated against influenza, but people still do die from it. And those are the people with the major comorbidities that get very sick and have got other issues. You know, we still are having deaths from COVID, but minority. You know, we've seen one or two here and there, and some are being reported as COVID deaths that aren't essentially COVID deaths. And yes, we have got one or two sick people, but it's a very small scale of infectious people that land up in hospital at the moment.
So the people that are getting COVID today, the majority of people, even if they're a little bit older. As long as they're not really vulnerable, they should be okay if they've been vaccinated and if they
I mean, that's if they've got good immunities, then they really should be okay.
It's the same as an older person getting a flu.
Right. As older as we still do recommend that people should be vaccinated.
All right, we're going to talk about that.
But essentially, it is the same type of issue.
What's happening in the rest of the world?
So, as I say, the United States, for instance, they're going into winter, the Northern Hemisphere going into winter. We're seeing large amounts of people getting COVID. But once again, the majority of people aren't landing up in hospital. So, yes, there's a few thousand here and a few thousand there. And, we're talking about a big population here of millions and millions of people. So the numbers are very small. But the other issue is that people aren't testing because there's no benefit or advantage to testing unless you're really sick and you need to isolate from somebody. But whereas a few months ago, everyone had to test because of isolation and quarantine and because of transmission, now people are saying, okay, I'm sick, I'll stay away for a few days and I'll get over it.
It's a bit of a controversial question, and it's a difficult one, I would imagine, for you to answer. But if people get sick, should they not test then?
So I think, if you look at somebody with, let's say, an asymptomatic infection, someone who doesn't present with symptoms, but for some reason they test and they're positive, what is the guidelines? The guidelines is that basically they don't have to isolate, but they should wear a mask if they go out for 5 days after that. If you've got a mild symptomatic infection, then you should isolate for 7 days. And if you've got a moderate to severe infection that you land up in hospital, then for 7 days after you come off oxygen, you should isolate. But essentially, what is the benefit ratio to testing at the moment except for transmission of the virus? So if you're sick, stay at home for a few days or wear a mask, because those are the barriers in how to protect yourself and other people from getting the infection.
In a way, shouldn't we be treating all infectious illnesses this way? If I've got a flu,
same as influenza,
shouldn't
A,
I stay away from people?
You should, and that's what people have to take that responsibility.
What about man flu? Because I get man flu
Yeah,
and I get it
the
quite
thing is
badly.
that you'd probably be at home for 375 days of a 365-day year, and then it would be a problem.
And then nobody
and then,
at home would be happy. Yeah. So I'm going to forget that. Let's just put that.
Put that aside.
Put that aside. Let's talk about. Well, it leads me almost, and we're going to come back to the vaccines and boosters and all of that. So I'm not forgetting about that, but to some extent, the question that I am absolutely drawn to is how the world has changed. And to some extent, just that little conversation that we had, well, shouldn't we be treating other infectious illnesses in the same way that we should treat COVID? Have we developed a different sensitivity and a way to looking at disease and illness?
I think we have. I think we've got to look back all the way back again to January 2020 when we realized that all our policies were directed against transmission of the virus. That was everything. That's all we had then. So we were using social measures to basically block transmission of the virus. All we had in those days was masks and gowns and aprons and that sort of way of protecting ourselves. But they are effective against blocking the disease. But things have progressed over time, and because of vaccination and because of all these other modalities we have to treat, like things like Paxlovid, which we don't have in this country, and Molnupiravir.
Whoa. What is that?
Paxlovid is the antiviral, which we've discussed many times.
Oh, it's not a disease.
It's not your disease, but if we can organize it for you, I'm sure we can add it to your list of diseases.
Fine.
So if we had those things help decrease the modality or the amount of time one stays in hospital and the duration of the disease. Remember, initially, early on, we didn't understand this virus. We didn't understand the severity. We didn't understand the pathology of it. We didn't understand the transmission. We weren't sure if it was a respiratory virus that was transmitted by droplets or was it aerosols.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you.
And we didn't know in those days because we didn't have the data. All we knew, people were getting sick. They were getting severely ill with respiratory complications, landing up on ventilators, going into ICU. The death rate was astronomical, and we were with our heads in the sand at that point in time because we didn't have enough data to correlate to work it all out.
Because if I recall those earlier photos of you in hazmat suits, from head to toe, not being able to eat or drink or go to the bathroom for hours whilst you were in the COVID wards. If that were to happen again today, knowing what you know, what of that was necessary?
I think all of it was necessary, especially for healthcare workers, because we had no immunity against this virus. So we had no protection.
I thought you'd just I thought the answer
Today's
was going to be...
Today's different. Today we've got immunity. Today we've had vaccines. Today we've got herd immunity. Today we've got ways to understand that, it is a respiratory virus, and the best way to protect yourself is wearing an N95 mask. Goggles do help, but those are the best ways. I mean, if you remember in the old days, we used to wipe down our packages from fomites, from all those type of things that would cause disease, and we were driving ourselves insane, saying, if you get your shopping, leave it for 24 hours, leave it outside, take your shoes off. But that was in a time when we had no other armamentarium against this disease. So we only had social measures in order to block it. It wasn't about how little we knew, it was that we didn't have. We were lacking. We didn't have the antivirals. We didn't have the vaccinations. So because of the advent of those things, it's changed the whole outcome of this virus.
No, but it is also what we didn't know, because even without that, we wouldn't have said, you wouldn't have said today, wipe your packages down.
Yes, but also you've got to understand something, that it initially started in Wuhan and Italy, and those are the biggest outbreaks there. And hundreds of doctors and healthcare workers died there because they weren't masking, they weren't gloving up, they didn't know how to actually deal with it.
So our lesson
Once
was
the advent of masking
started,
the decrease in deaths was astronomical.
Yeah, it's amazing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely phenomenal. Do you, in the medical world, I'm not sure if you always wore a mask.
We didn't wear masks before. It was the only time we used to wear masks was when we were treating TB patients. Right. Because it's a respiratory droplet transmissible disease.
So somebody came to you in your rooms, you wouldn't have been wearing a mask?
Never wore a mask, never had any barriers, never wore gloves, never had any barrier protection.
What does it look like today?
We wear masks. I mean, majority of respiratory physicians and people involved in people with lung conditions wear masks. Obviously, the surgeons still wear masks when they do operating in theatre and that type of thing. But you'll find your ICU intensivists and your respiratory physicians are all wearing masks in the hospital, because not only are we protecting ourselves from things like COVID, but we're protecting ourselves from RSV, adenovirus, influenza. I mean, we all used to laugh at the Chinese and the Japanese used to walk around in masks for years. But now it's us who are the laughing stock, because we should have been doing this for years. And now we've learned. Why expose yourself to a virus or expose your family to a virus when there's a simple way to protect yourself?
Right.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, China has taken the approach of non-transmission, and it actually isn't working.
Yeah.
There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of...
You see, that's the problem. There's a psychological, there's a financial, there's a whole lot of stressful additives that go with that. You cannot mask 24 hours a day. It's impossible. There's a social structure. That's why we always say, go outside, be outside in the fresh air. You can't force people to wear masks. Initially, we had to isolate and quarantine because that was the only way we could stop transmission of the droplets. Now it's different.
So let's just go back to vaccines and boosters. I mean, the last vaccine I had was a couple of months ago. Maybe, I don't remember when it was. Let's say it was March, April. Should people be getting boosters? What are the side effects? What are the risks? Because to some extent, social media is still going on about the risks of the vaccines, and that it's kind of relentless, this type of thing. And slowly that makes its way into our subconscious, and we start to get nervous about
So
boosters.
I think one's got to understand that vaccines protect and they decrease the rate of infection and limit transmission. That was the overall sort of reason why the vaccines were administered and given. We know now that people's immunity levels have decreased. There's newer variants around. But if you look around, billions, and I'm talking about billions of vaccines have been administered, and there's no doubt that they have saved lives. I mean, the drop of deaths from the advent of the starting of the vaccination drive. I mean, South Africa has done over 37 million vaccines, okay? There's no doubt this was the game changer. The vaccination process and the vaccination of people is what quashed this virus. Yes, it's around still, and as I say, influenza is still around, but, you shouldn't respect it as much as you used to respect it. We shouldn't be fearful of it. It should be fearful of us now because we know things that we didn't know before.
Right.
And there's a lot of talk about all side effects and all things, and we've spoken multiple times about what the side effects are. Things were like myocarditis in the 12 to 39-year-old males, especially. We know those with the mRNA vaccines, like the Pfizer type of thing. And they said, draw out the stage between your first and your second vaccine, and just make sure you don't exercise for a week afterwards. It does happen. We know that's a very, very small proportion of people that it happens to, but there's a higher risk of getting myocarditis from the COVID itself than from the vaccine. Then there was the other talk of the thrombosis with the thrombocytopenia. That was the blood clots with the low platelets. That was with the Johnson & Johnson. And that was in women you had to be careful of. That was a concern, but also a very, very small cohort of people. Other things, if I remember correctly, were the menstrual irregularities. And it has been noted there's been a very small cohort of people that do get menstrual irregularities, and that means heavier bleeding for a week or two, and then that resolves on its own. It doesn't affect fertility.
There was no fertility issues.
No fertility issues at all.
Because that was
These
a
issues
big,
resolved.
big one that people
Another big issue was the increase of herpes zoster and shingles, and that's been shown to
But it's so interesting
blown out
because
the
there's
walls.
definitely been, anecdotally, I've heard of a lot more younger people getting shingles
But I
than
think,
I have
I
in
think
the
it goes
past.
back to other things. I don't think it's about the vaccines. I think it's about the state where we are in an immunity and stressful.
Maybe
Stress and
stress,
immunity
yeah.
are
So
interlinked.
interesting. I think you're right.
If your stress levels are through the roof, your immunity's down. Once your immunity's down, that's it. You're a
shingles in
sucker for
particular-
punishment.
Is shingles a stress related?
Definitely shingles is a stress-related type of,
Yeah, and we've lived through
of disease.
very, very stressful
Well,
times.
we're living through stressful times.
Yeah.
So those are things that, the other talks were of the Guillain-Barré syndrome that people, can cause paresthesia, can cause paraplegia, can cause respiratory issues. Once again, the numbers are extremely low, and the benefit ratio versus the risk ratio is just too high not to be vaccinated.
Well, I have to tell you that the impact that the vaccine had on me is I haven't been able to exercise for months.
Yeah, you see, now that's something that you're going to have to write up in the New England Journal of Rubbish,
Right.
because that's an absolute brilliant thing.
No, I'm telling
and
you,
it makes
it's
sense.
actually been a
we
problem.
can see the effects of the lack of exercise. It definitely is. Yes.
yeah.
They say
Anyway.
grass doesn't grow on a busy highway.
So there we go. And
But if, on a serious note, going back to should we be vaccinated again?
Yes,
I think
boosters.
you've got to look at where you are with infections. So we are seeing a rise in numbers of infections at the moment. There's no doubt about it. So if you're lucky enough to be over the age of 50, present company excluded, then if you're due for your fourth booster, I would say have your fourth booster.
but then I
Because,
can't exercise
hey,
for a week.
yes, you shouldn't exercise for a week, but I don't think that's going to have a negative impact on your week, I must say.
No, probably not. No,
It's a
seriously,
double negative for you.
It is a serious question.
So
Because
yes, I do believe that we should be having our fourth vaccine, especially going into the holiday period now, especially because we aren't masking anymore and we don't have to mask. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah,
We don't
yeah.
have to mask at the moment. Social etiquette has changed very much because now we're no longer in a risk situation, but we are still aware of the adverse effects of the virus, and we still got to be careful from that point of view. And in order to protect us, we need to be vaccinated. That being said, there are a lot of studies have shown that the immunity from the fourth vaccine does wane after 12 to 13 weeks, etc. So therefore, you should have it at a time when the infections are on the rise. There are new vaccines coming about. There's what we call a bivalent vaccine. That includes a sequence from Wuhan HU1 as well as from the Omicron BA1. So it's actually a combination of the two, whereas the one we're getting now is just the Wuhan HU1 sequence. Right. So that will be far more effective. But I can't see us getting this in South Africa until maybe February, March, at least next year. So to wait until then to get vaccinated.
Would you recommend?
Right
Just
now, I'd
go with the
recommend
Pfizer.
go with the Pfizer. Yeah.
Right.
Especially if they're over the age of 50. Unfortunately, for some brilliant reason with our wonderful government, you can't get it if you're under the age of 50. So even if you're a healthcare
really?
worker on the front line,
What do you mean?
still can't
As a
get it.
healthcare worker under
Still
the
can't
age
get
of
it.
50, you can't get a booster.
Yeah.
Because that makes sense.
Yeah.
To no one.
Welcome to load
Right.
shedding.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Let's talk about long COVID.
Okay, so long COVID is a big issue. It's got many names. It's called long COVID, Hall syndrome, long COVID, sequential syndrome. It could be called PASC, which is post-acute sequelae of COVID, which in other words is the consequences of COVID. The majority of symptoms of long COVID are the fatigue and the cognitive issues, as well as respiratory issues. I think in order to diagnose long COVID, you've got to understand that it's in somebody who's had an acute infection, and then 3 months later, they develop symptoms for about 2 months that can't be ascribed to any other condition. So the fatigue or the headaches or the loss of smell, the loss of taste, or even the respiratory complication, the shortness of breath or the coughing, we're seeing a major rise in asthmatics. We see a lot of people with lung fibrosis, which is scar tissue in the lungs, people who were sick with COVID at the time, and it didn't make a difference if they were healthy or unhealthy with lung condition at the time. In fact, funny enough, anecdotally, in our small hospital population, our emphysema patients didn't get as affected from lung fibrosis as much as other patients. And there's no answer to it. No. Whereas I spoke to somebody from America yesterday, and he said it was opposite there, where their emphysema patients were extremely affected. So, there's just no way to work it out. But long COVID is a problem, and you've got to understand that it can be debilitating because of the fatigue and because of the cognitive problems, because of memory problems. Do
we need a number of those symptoms together to determine?
You need at least two.
Because fatigue is also a sign of other things like stress.
Like stress. But the point is, you can't just say I've had long COVID if you haven't had the symptoms for 3 months post having an acute infection. If you had it in January 2020 and now you wake up and say, I think I've got long COVID because it's unlikely. One of the major treatments or ways to help with it was a revaccination, which found that it brought down the rates of the effects of the long COVID. And there are long COVID clinics that are developed all over the world. There's some in the Western Cape at the moment. A lot of treatments are out there. A lot of treatments.
What are the treatments for long COVID?
So it's all symptomatic treatment.
Okay, so it's got to be specific to
certain things, especially I know they're doing it in America and Israel, they're giving hyperbaric oxygen, for the cognitive effects and for some of the breathing issues, which you basically sit in a hyperbaric oxygen tank for 30 sessions, which is like 30 hours over a number of weeks to try and improve the symptoms. And there has been evidence that this does help. So a lot of the other things that we're not looking at and that should be looked at is the mental side of it, the depression, the anxiety, the stress.
Because I'm not sure it's only long COVID.
The rate of suicide attempts, what people are feeling have increased a lot. And even what our elderly went through being alone during that time, even elderly people, the suicide attempts have gone up.
I think our elderly community suffered most because of the isolation.
Right.
There's no doubt that the impact on older people and the fear that they lived with, that if they're going to go out, they're going to see their family, they could die from it. I mean, it's an incredibly painful thing to live with.
Yeah, but more painful is to live with the fact that for 2 or 3 years they didn't see anybody and they lost out on everything. I mean, look at our kids. Look at how they lost out on being social or lost out on going to camps. I mean, this year they're going to camp. This year the great news is life is back to normal. People are living, people are doing what they should be doing, albeit there's a large, I'd say, cloud over there with people's stress and anxiety.
So that's what I want to talk about.
The levels are extremely high at the moment. Our mental health is a big problem at the moment.
Do you think that is...
That's actually quite an oxymoron for you, mental and health. That's quite interesting.
Do you think that could be as a direct result of the illness itself, or is it more about the other stuff?
I think the two go hand in hand. I think
went with it.
Because of the illness, because of the anxiety related to it, and because of the stuff that went with it at the same time. I don't think the illness attacks the serotonin receptors in the brain.
That's really what I'm asking.
But it's stuff related to it. So it's all the sequelae, all the consequences.
So are you seeing a lot more people on medication for mental health?
We're putting a lot more people on medication because people just aren't coping. Even financially, people aren't coping.
We've also got that double whammy in South Africa.
We've seen people that are downgrading the medical aids. We've seen people that are cancelling appointments because they just don't have the money for it. And that's now the knock-on effect that we're seeing from all the quarantines and the isolations and the lack of funds generated during that time.
That's very, very scary.
Yeah.
So
and then you take things like load shedding and you take water interruptions and that just
very specific
compounds
South
everything.
African stresses.
We basically we're waiting for that last straw to break the camel's back.
No, stop it.
But that's what the problem is, and that's what we've got to address, and that's what we've got to actually work out is how to prevent that straw from causing us issues.
So in your practice, I mean, you're a physician, pulmonologist. Obviously,
psychologist.
Well, not so sure. Obviously, mental health plays a very important part in people's illnesses.
Right.
But over the last 2 years, have you seen an increased influence of mental health on people's physical.
Yes, there's no doubt about it. Either people are putting on weight because they're not exercising, or they're not taking care of their health because everything's been pushed aside. They don't go for their regular checkups. Obviously, we've seen more cases of cancer because people couldn't get
they just couldn't
to
go
doctors
there.
because there was just no facility in order to be helpful for them to be protected in that type of environment. So I've always believed that there's a big link between stress and cancer, and when you have a major stressful event, it almost like it kills a certain amount of cells in your body, and that area where the cells are killed, open yourself up to some disease or some process from that. So if you don't address that, then you're going down a road where you're going to develop disease. And that's why we have to be so careful. We have to address these things. And that's why we have to get people involved that can help us through this time.
So what do you suggest?
So whether it's going to see a psychologist or whether it's going to medication or support groups, these are important things to deal with. But I don't think to push it under the carpet and say, don't worry, you'll get over it. That's not the answer.
Let's just talk about how people like yourselves have dealt with it, because there was no doubt when some of the times that we spoke, it was absolutely clear to me that you were in the middle of a major crisis that was going to result in some form of PTSD. Do you think you suffer from PTSD?
I think we're too stupid to suffer from PTSD as healthcare workers. What we do is
you have to explain
I have to explain, because what we do is we take an episode, we take an event, we box it, we put it in a box, and we put it into the subconfines or the back memory of the thing, and we compartmentalize things.
But you've been taught you have to do
we
that.
deal with things on a different level to the way that the general person will deal with it, and we put it away. So, in other words, it doesn't affect me now. It does affect, yes, there are certain times when, as a human being, you have emotional sort of memories of these type of things that do affect you. But in the line of work we do, we just got to push on forward. So,
but doesn't it burst through? Is that practical?
So
is it real?
I think without realizing it, when you're working with a lot of doctors, you bounce things off each other.
Okay, so you are dealing with it, but you're dealing with it in a different sort of way.
In a non-sort of regulatory way, not the way that you would say, you don't sit down with a psychologist and deal with it. And I think if we needed to, we would. But we don't feel we need to. We get busy with other things, so we don't have to deal with that.
Have you seen doctors getting burnt out?
Yes, more? Burnout is a major issue at the moment.
I would have thought so.
Today is the 20th of November. It's as if it's the 20th of December because people are just gatvol. And I know we don't speak Afrikaans in this country. But
no, only 44 of us do.
Only 44 people do, but people are gatvol. They're done. They've had enough, People are tired. They are burnt out. And it's not only from everything, it's just from the conglomeration of all the things that have gone on over the last 2.5 years. And finally now, it's like you've been through a major crisis and all of a sudden you're slowing down. And then when you slow down, then the exhaustion and the fatigue and all these things hit.
That's really what motivated me to want to sit down today, because it's almost as though there's like a little bit of a distance between us and the crisis of COVID. And I wanted to use this opportunity to look back on it and be able to say, how, what does the world look like today? What state are we in? What can we expect going forward?
I think we mustn't forget what we've learned from COVID from an ethical point of view, from a planning point of view. And when I say from a planning point of view, is that you can plan whatever you want, but man plans and God laughs, and so you've always got to have a second plan. You can't always rely on one plan in life because things sometimes do go awry, but eventually, that being said, the awriness dissolves and things come right, and we can see it now. Things have come right in a major way. People are much healthier, and people are going to work on themselves, and they can all go get that vitamin C, SEA, which is a big thing if they can. Which is a big thing. So it changes the whole dynamics of people.
And we've opened up conversations. We are more free to talk about things like mental health and stress compared to 2 years ago, when it was a subject that didn't really come into the workplace. Yeah. It didn't come into many of our conversations, but now we're actually fairly open about it. I
always say to people, if you fracture your hip, are you going to walk with a crutch? And the answer is, obviously. So more so, if you've got mental health issues, are you going to see a psychologist or are you going to go into medication? Why is there a stereotype between the two? There shouldn't
stigma,
be. Yeah, it's actually a stereotype because people say, well, I'm with a psychologist. Well, there's something wrong with that person, And it's not. It's that everything has got its place and everyone needs someone to help them through whatever it may be.
How long till COVID becomes completely irrelevant?
I think it would turn out to be like influenza. It's not irrelevant, but we're aware of it. It's going to be another one of those viruses, And I think on a yearly basis. What I do believe they are going to do is they're going to combine the flu vaccine with the COVID vaccine and make it into one vaccine. That will be on a yearly basis. I believe that is where we're
And
going.
just to reiterate, you are a strong proponent of the flu vaccine.
Just in case you never heard it before.
In case you
the
knew
flu
at
vaccine,
this,
the
yeah.
pneumonia vaccine, the shingles vaccine, all these things are
If there's a vaccine
extremely
going,
important.
take it, according to...
Well, not all of them. An exercise
All right,
vaccine.
and
I'd
that's
really
why
like you to
people
have an
don't
exercise
come
vaccine.
to me for medical advice. All right, I didn't hear what you said, but that's also absolutely fine. So do we end on even more good news?
Well, there's good news because, great day today, World Cup soccer starting. Just don't drink your Budweiser because you might get in
You don't know
trouble
what
for
I've got
that.
in this cup. Mhm.
Truth is, I do know what you got in that cup. That's what worries me even more. And we're in a good place. We've come a full circle from where we were. We've come from devastation, from disaster, from tragedy to out there. We've come into a garden. We've come into a fresh garden of blossoms and flowers where then we can see those unicorns. Those unicorns are there. Everyone always said, when are the unicorns? The unicorns are here. Now we've got to take advantage of those unicorns and say, let's ride those unicorns and go out into the pastures.
Actually live a life.
And obviously, how can I not mention my soccer team? But Liverpool, thank God, have turned around their season. They've started playing great soccer again. And thank God there's a 4-week break where they can have a break and get better from that point of view. And I think a very important quote is, especially what we were discussing, is that mental health is not a destination. It's a process. It's about how you drive, not where you're going.
Love that.
Enjoy your holidays. Be well. Be mentally well. Be physically well. Enjoy yourselves. Take life and enjoy it.
Absolutely, the gift of life that we have been given. Dr. Anton Meyberg, thank you. As always, thank you for agreeing to come back into studio today. I felt it was important.
I was bullied.
Yes, you were. Yes, you were, but only for good reasons. I'm Howard Feldman. This has been an episode of the Synthesis Sunday podcast. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe below for more episodes as they come. Have a great week. God bless.